The floorboard was empty. Lynnette dropped to her knees and pressed both hands into the hollow space beneath it, feeling every corner, every edge, as if her fingers could produce what her eyes already confirmed was gone. The journal was not there. 3 years of secrets, 3 years of feelings she had never been permitted to speak out loud, 3 years of writing about a man she had no right to love, and it was gone. Someone had found it. Her mind moved fast and ugly through the possibilities, and every single one of them led to the same place, the same person. She pressed her hand flat against the cold floor and told herself to breathe and told herself to think, and then she stopped thinking entirely and she ran. She ran through the side door and across the wet grounds and did not stop until she reached the old stone cottage at the far edge of the estate, the one place no one would think to look for her. She pushed the door shut and pressed her back against the wood and squeezed her, eyes closed, and told herself she was safe here, that no one knew about this place, that she had time to think. Then the knock came. Quiet, deliberate. The knock of someone who knew exactly where she was. She didn't move. The door opened anyway, and he stood in the frame with the grey morning light behind him and her journal pressed against his side, and his eyes finding hers across the dark room with an expression she had never seen on his face before and never expected to see directed at her. He said 4 words. "I have read everything. Now tell me, if the person you had loved in silence for 3 years found every word you were never brave enough to say, would you stay and face them? Or would you run again? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from right now. It truly helps more than you know. And if this story already has its hand around your heart, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will completely undo you. The journal was not where she had left it. Lynnette Vale turned the loose floorboard over twice, then pressed her palms flat against the cold wood as if she had somehow missed it. She had not missed it. The space beneath the board was empty, and the breath she pulled in next came out as something close to a silent scream. 3 years. She had protected that journal for 3 years. 3 years of writing down every thought she was never allowed to speak out loud. Every evening she had watched the Duke of Ashfare cross the drawing room and felt something shift inside her chest that had no business being there. Every morning she reminded herself exactly who she was. A companion, a paid position, a woman whose feelings were not part of any arrangement. And she had written all of it down, every last word. Now it is gone. She stood and pressed both hands against her stomach and breathed through her nose and tried to think clearly. The house moved around her the way it always did. Footsteps on the stairs below. The distant clatter of the kitchen staff. Somewhere above, Lady Portia Ashfare was attempting the same 3 bars of the same melody she had been working on since Tuesday. All of it is familiar. All of it today feels completely wrong. Lynnette forced herself to move. She was the companion to Miss Harriet Fenwick, the Duke's ward, a position she had held for nearly 3 years. She had come to Ashfare House at 22, quiet and capable and grateful, and she had learned quickly how to be useful without being visible. She organized Harriet's correspondence, accompanied her to calls and visits, and read to her in the evenings when headaches made bright light unbearable. Present in every room and noticed in almost none of them, which had always suited her perfectly. Until the journal. She had started writing in it during her 2nd month at Ashfare House, when the loneliness of the position had pressed against her ribs in a way she had not anticipated. She was not unhappy. She was genuinely fond of Harriet, who was warm and funny in a dry, unexpected way that caught Lynnette off guard at least twice a day. She liked the house and its rhythm, and the wide, flat fields and the particular quality of the late afternoon light when everything went gold at the edges. What she had not planned for was the Duke. His Grace, Dorian Ashvere, was 31 years old, the 8th Duke of his line, and the kind of man who walked into a room and made every other person in it adjust their posture without knowing why. He was not warm in the way Harriet was warm. He was precise, measured. He said exactly what he meant, and listened when others spoke with a quality of attention that felt, when turned on you, like being held very carefully by something very large. Lynnette had spent 3 years being almost entirely invisible to him, which was correct and appropriate, and exactly as it should be. She had also spent 3 years writing about him in a small leather journal with a red ribbon tied around the cover, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, which was neither correct nor appropriate, nor anything close to how it should be. The entries were honest in the way that private things are honest when no one is watching. She had written about the slight tension at the corner of his jaw when a problem had not yet resolved itself. She had written about the evening she had come to the library for a book and found him still there, and they had spoken for 20 minutes about nothing consequential, and she had gone upstairs and lain awake for 2 hours because she could not stop thinking about the way he had smiled at something, she said, just slightly, just at the corner of his mouth. She had written things like, "I am aware that what I feel is not something I am permitted to feel, and I intend to go on feeling it quietly until it stops, which I expect will be any day now." That entry was from 8 months ago. It had not stopped. And now the journal is gone. She spent the better part of the morning searching every room she had access to. She checked the sitting room 3 more times, looked through the corridor cupboards, even searched the morning room and the small parlour on the east side that she used occasionally when Harriet wanted quiet. She found nothing. By early afternoon, her hands were trembling, and her thoughts had narrowed to a single sharp point of panic that she could not reason her way past. She went to check on Harriet at 2:30, and found her resting with a cold compress across her forehead, a headache having arrived with its usual inconvenient timing. Harriet looked up from beneath the compress and said, without preamble, "You look pale." "I am always pale," Lynnette said, settling into the chair by the window. "Different kinds of pale. The kind that means something has happened." "Nothing has happened," Lynnette said. Harriet looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression she used when deciding whether to press a point or let it go. She let it go, which was somehow worse than pressing would have been. Lynnette stayed with Harriet for an hour, and then excused herself, and walked the upper corridor twice more, checking every surface and every shelf with diminishing hope and increasing dread. At 4 o'clock she passed Mr. Crane coming downstairs with the expression he used when a task was slightly outside the usual parameters. "Miss Vale," he said, "His Grace would like a word about the guest arrangements for the weekend, in the East Corridor, when you have a moment." She found the Duke in the East Corridor, standing at the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grey garden. He turned when she approached, and asked about Harriet's requirements for the weekend guests, whether her physician had confirmed attendance at Saturday dinner, whether the south sitting room had been arranged as a quieter retreat. She answered every question steadily and correctly, and he nodded and thanked her and walked back toward the main staircase. He had not been holding the journal. She stood in the corridor after he left and told herself she was catastrophizing. She told herself it had simply slipped from the board during the week and would be found somewhere sensible. She told herself to go to her room and sit quietly and stop imagining the worst. Instead, she walked to the far end of the corridor, turned down the back staircase, pushed through the side door, and stepped out into the cold grey afternoon. She did not stop walking until she reached the groundskeeper's cottage at the far edge of the estate grounds, a small stone building half hidden by overgrown hedgerow that the current groundskeeper, old Mr. Potts, used only for storing tools since his retirement to the village the previous winter. She had discovered it in her first autumn at Ashfare House on a long, solitary walk, and she had never told anyone about it, and she had never needed it until now. She pushed the door open and stepped inside and pulled it shut behind her and stood in the dim, cold quiet with her back against the wood and her eyes closed and let herself fall apart for exactly the amount of time she could afford, which was not very long. She was still standing there when the knock came. Quiet, deliberate, not the knock of someone who had stumbled across the cottage by accident. She did not move. The door opened anyway. He stood in the frame with the grey afternoon light behind him, tall and still, his dark coat damp at the shoulders from the mist that had begun settling over the grounds. His expression gave nothing away, and pressed flat against his side, held with a care that suggested he had been carrying it close for some time, was a small leather book with a worn red ribbon tied around its cover. Her journal. The world went completely silent around her. His eyes found hers across the dim room and held them, and he said, in a voice so quiet and so steady it nearly broke her apart completely, "I have read every word." She could not speak. She could not move. She stood with her back against the cottage door and looked at the journal in his hand and felt the full weight of 3 years pressing down on her all at once. "I found it on Wednesday evening," he said. "I was checking the window latch in the sitting room adjacent to your quarters. The board was already slightly displaced. I did not go looking." He paused. "I read the first page and I intended to stop. I did not stop, and I am not going to offer you a comfortable excuse for that." Still she said nothing. "I came here," he said, "because Mr. Potts mentioned once that you sometimes walked this far on your afternoon walks, and because I needed to speak with you before the weekend guests arrived, and the house became too full for any honest conversation." He held the journal out toward her. "This belongs to you. It has always belonged to you." She crossed the small space between them and took it from his hands, and the moment her fingers closed around the leather cover, something in her chest that had been held at a terrible tension for 2 days released all at once. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that careful, unreadable expression. Except that now, standing this close in the dim cottage light, she could see that it was not entirely unreadable. There was something underneath it she had no word for, something that made her grip the journal tighter. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. Her voice was very small, but it was steady. "Nothing that you do not wish me to do," he said. "But I would like to speak with you, properly. This evening, if you are willing. In the library after dinner, when the house is quiet." He paused. "There are things I should have said a long time ago, and I find I am no longer willing to wait." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once. He stepped back from the doorway to let her pass. She walked back toward the house through the cold grey afternoon with the journal pressed against her chest and her heart beating with something that was equal parts terror and something she refused, for now, to name. The guests arrived at 11 o'clock Friday morning in 2 carriages, filling the entrance hall of Ashfare House with bright social energy that the house did not usually contain. Miss Tatum Graves stepped down first, beautiful and aware of it, with copper hair piled high and sharp green eyes that moved through a room like a hand sorting cards, assessing and discarding quickly. She greeted Lady Portia with warmth, and the Duke with a smile that carried an unmistakable question inside it. Miss Odette Fairfax followed, quieter, with a wide, observant face and ink-stained fingers she had made no attempt to hide, already filing away everything she saw for later consideration. She shook the Duke's hand with a briskness that was almost impolite, which surprised him into a brief, genuine expression before his composure returned. Mr. Percy Wainwright descended from the second carriage already talking, 3 sentences into a story about a coaching inn incident involving a goose, a male sack, and a misunderstanding of spectacular proportions. Lady Portia laughed until her eyes watered. The Duke pinched the bridge of his nose. Behind Mr. Wainwright came 2 others Lynnette had not expected. Lord Theodore Fenwick, Harriet's older brother, 26, and carrying the efficient confidence of a man who owned most rooms he entered. And beside him, introduced casually as a fellow from Wainwright's club, Mr. Sebastian Holt, lean and sandy-haired, with a quality of careful observation about him that reminded Lynnette uncomfortably of herself. Lynnette stood to one side of the entrance hall in her correct position, close enough to be useful, far enough back to be functionally invisible. Harriet stood beside her, headache temporarily in retreat, her dark eyes moving over the arrivals with sharp pleasure. "Theo looks well," Harriet murmured. "He does," Lynnette agreed. "Also like he has been in London too long. That particular restlessness." Harriet tilted her head. "I do not know, Mr. Holt." "Neither do I." Mr. Holt chose that moment to look across the hall, and his eyes landed on Lynnette with a directness that was not quite rude, but was more attentive than she was accustomed to from strangers. She held the look for a polite second and shifted her gaze, and when she glanced back he had moved on, already speaking to Lord Fenwick. The morning passed in the organized movement of settling guests, arranging rooms, managing the social arithmetic of people who all knew each other to different degrees. Mrs. Dallow moved through it all like a ship in mild weather. Mr. Crane directed the footman with clipped precision. Lynnette stayed close to Harriet and performed her function quietly. At luncheon, she was seated between Mr. Wainwright and Miss Fairfax, directly in Miss Fairfax's line of sight. Miss Fairfax ate quickly, folded her hands, and looked at Lynnette with frank interest. "You are Miss Vale, Harriet's companion." "I am," Lynnette said. "Harriet writes to me, occasionally. She says you are the most sensible person she knows, which from Harriet is the highest possible compliment." "She is very kind," Lynnette said. "She is accurate," Miss Fairfax said. "Harriet does not give compliments she does not mean." Across the table, the Duke was speaking quietly with Mr. Holt. Lynnette was not trying to hear the conversation. She was simply aware of it, the way she was always aware of whatever was happening in his immediate vicinity, against her better judgment and general preference. On her other side, Mr. Wainwright was delivering the coaching inn story to Lord Fenwick at full volume, having decided the doorstep audience had been insufficient and the full dramatic retelling was required. Lord Fenwick listened with the expression of a man still deciding whether this would be entertaining or merely very long. After luncheon, when the group dispersed into afternoon activities, Lynnette slipped out through the side door for air and turned the corner, around the kitchen garden wall directly into Mr. Sebastian Holt. He caught her arm, released it immediately, and stepped back. "I beg your pardon." "Not at all," she said. "I was not watching where I was going." "Nor was I." He straightened his coat. His face showed its thoughts more plainly than he probably realized. "Mr. Sebastian Holt, we were not properly introduced this morning." "Miss Lynnette Vale," she said, "Harriet's companion. I understand you have been here several years." Nearly 3, she said, and shifted the conversation with the ease of practice. Are you enjoying the county, Mr. Holt? It is rather quieter than London. I prefer quiet, he said, and smiled with the genuine warmth of someone who meant it. I am not particularly suited to London, despite what Percy believes. What does Mr. Wainwright believe? That I need to get out more, that a weekend in the country with a duke and his charming household will be good for my constitution. The smile again, slightly wry. Percy's solutions to everything involve other people. Lynnette found, to her surprise, that she liked Mr. Holt. There was something disarmingly straightforward about him that made it difficult not to. She excused herself after a few minutes and went back inside and spent the remainder of the afternoon close to Harriet, reading aloud and arranging correspondence, doing everything her position required while the evening she had agreed to move steadily closer. At 4:30, Harriet set down her book and looked at Lynnette with searching dark eyes. Something is happening, she said. Not something bad. Something different. You have been somewhere else all afternoon. I am here, Lynnette said. Your hands are here, Harriet said. That is not quite the same thing. Lynnette looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say yet that would not require saying everything, and she was not ready for that. Harriet did not press. She simply reached across and squeezed Lynnette's hand briefly and returned to her book, which was its own kind of answer. At 8:30, when the house had settled into its after-dinner quiet and the other guests had moved to the drawing room, Lynnette walked to the library at the far end of the first floor and knocked on the open door. The fire had been built up properly, and the room was warm and golden. The Duke stood at the far bookshelf, and when she entered, he turned and set down the book in his hands, and looked at her with that careful expression that she had spent 3 years reading incorrectly, and was only now beginning to understand. You came, he said. I said I would, she answered. She stepped fully into the library and closed the door behind her, and whatever had been waiting between them for 3 years finally had nowhere left to hide. He gestured to the chair nearest the fireplace. She sat. He did not sit immediately. He crossed to the desk, picked up something small, and placed it on the table beside her chair. Not the journal this time. A single folded note, blank on the outside, which he had clearly written and reconsidered and chosen not to send. I wrote that yesterday, he said, after I found you in the cottage. I intended to have Mr. Crane deliver it this morning, and then decided that what I needed to say could not be managed in a letter. She looked at the folded note and did not touch it. He settled into the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped. It was not a posture she had ever seen him take. He was always upright, always composed in the vertical sense. This was someone sitting the way you sat when you intended to say something real. I want to tell you something before anything else, he said. She waited. When I came to Ashvere House after my father's death, I was not in a state to notice much. The estate, Portia, Harriet, 400 obligations that left no room for anything personal. He paused. What changed afterward was not sudden. It was gradual, and I did not name it to myself until considerably later than I should have. What changed? She asked. You, he said. Not dramatically, not in any single moment I could point to, but you were honest and kind to Harriet in a way that had nothing to do with it, and when you spoke, you said exactly what you meant. Something moved across his face, and you laughed at things that were actually funny. That sounds like a small observation. It does not sound small to me, she said quietly. No, he said. I did not think it would. The fire burned low and steady to her left. Outside the library windows the night was fully dark, the grounds invisible beyond the glass. "The entry from the 14th of March, he said. She closed her eyes briefly. "You wrote that you stood outside this door for 7 minutes, then came in for a book, and we spoke for 20 minutes, and you went upstairs and lay awake thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "After you left that night, I sat in this room for another hour. Not working, just sitting." "Why?" she asked. "Because the most honest conversation I had experienced in longer than I could calculate had just ended, and the person I had it with was going to come down to breakfast the next morning and be perfectly correct, and I was going to do the same, and we were both going to continue doing that indefinitely." The tension appeared at the corner of his jaw. It was deeply unsatisfying. Despite everything, something close to laughter moved through her. She pressed her lips together. He saw it. "You find this amusing?" "I find it completely impossible," she said. "And also, yes, slightly amusing." "Good. I was hoping you would not simply be terrified." "I am also terrified," she said. "That is fair," he said. "So am I." That settled into the space between them and changed something, the temperature of the room or the weight of the air, in a way neither of them addressed directly, but both of them felt. "There are complications," she said, because she was a practical person, and practical things did not stop existing simply because the impossible was happening in a warm library at night. "Several," he agreed. "I am employed in your household. Harriet depends on me." "And one of your guests." She paused, thinking of Miss Tatum Graves and her assessing green eyes. "Appears to have expectations of a different kind of conversation with you this weekend." "Miss Graves is here because Portia invited her," he said. "My sister has developed the habit of placing people she considers useful in my vicinity without consulting me. I have not encouraged Miss Graves. I will not." "She is very beautiful," Lynnette said. "She is," he said, without hesitation. "So are you." The fire crackled once. She flushed, which she almost never did, and disliked herself mildly for it. "That is not a relevant consideration," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is simply a true one." She looked down at her hands in her lap and thought about every night she had written in that journal and every morning she had hidden it again, and all the space in between when she had believed that feeling something privately and keeping it contained were two activities she could maintain permanently separate. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. He considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to know you properly. Not across a dinner table with 12 other people. Not in the corridor for 2 minutes before you excuse yourself. I want to speak with you the way we spoke that night in March, and be able to do it without either of us pretending afterward that nothing shifted. And beyond that, whatever you are willing to give," he said. "Nothing more than that until you are ready." It was so precisely right that she nearly told him so, and then kept it to herself, and stored it in the place where she kept everything about him. She was not yet prepared to release. She stood, because if she remained in that chair by that fire much longer, she would lose the last thread of composure she was holding, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. "The entry from the 3rd of October, she said, stopping at the door. He went very still. "You were reading in the garden. Last warm day of autumn. You had left your coat on the bench and were sitting in your shirt sleeves, which you clearly did not realize anyone could see from the upstairs window." She paused. "I wrote 4 pages about it. I want you to know I am fully aware that this is excessive." She left before he could respond, which was the only way to leave that room with any dignity remaining, and she walked back to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed the journal against her chest and breathed until her hands stopped trembling. 4 minutes later, Miss Odette Fairfax knocked on her door, holding 2 cups of tea and the expression of someone who had spent an hour in Mr. Wainwright's orbit and urgently needed a quieter intelligence to rest against. Lynnette let her in without hesitation. Odette settled into the window seat and looked around the room with frank appraisal, and then looked at Lynnette and said, without any prelude whatsoever, "The Duke looks at you the way people look at things they have spent a long time trying not to want and have recently stopped trying." Lynnette set her teacup down very carefully. "I noticed at luncheon," Odette continued pleasantly, "he does it when you are not looking directly at him, which suggests he has been doing it long enough to develop a system." "Odette," Lynnette said, "you do not have to confirm anything. I am making an observation." She sipped her tea. "Harriet is genuinely fond of you. Not in the way people are fond of useful things. In this way people are fond of people." Something warm moved through Lynnette's chest. "I know. I am very fond of her." "Good. Then you should know that Lord Fenwick sent her a letter this afternoon about a man in Edinburgh he has decided she ought to consider for marriage, while staying in the same house, while she is sitting 20 feet down the corridor." Lynnette was already standing. She thanked Odette, left her installed comfortably in the window seat, and went directly to Harriet's room. She found Harriet at her writing desk, with the letter open in front of her, and her dark eyes very calm in the way that came just before a particular kind of storm. "He sent it to my room," Harriet said. "A letter about a man I have never met, while he is 20 feet away." "What does the Duke know?" Lynnette asked. "I have no idea," Harriet said, "but I intend to find out." Dinner was an exercise in sustained performance, and Lynnette had never been more grateful for 3 years of practice at being decorously invisible. The dining room looked well. Tall silver candlesticks softened every face in the room. The food came out in correct order, with the efficiency Mr. Crane demanded on formal occasions. Externally, everything was fine. Internally, the room carried 4 separate private storms that none of the people inside them were acknowledging out loud. Lord Theodore Fenwick ate with the composed appetite of a man who believed he had done a practical and generous thing, and was waiting for the people around him to recognize it. He spoke easily with Mr. Wainwright and Lady Portia, and gave no indication whatsoever that his sister had spent the afternoon in cold fury over a letter he had sent 20 feet down a corridor. Harriet sat between Mr. Holt and Miss Graves, and was magnificent, warm, attentive, genuinely funny. She drew Mr. Holt into a conversation about his translation work and watched him light up discussing it, his carefully guarded face becoming something considerably more open. She laughed at Miss Graves's London observations with what appeared to be real amusement. She ate well and gave no external sign of what was burning quietly underneath all of it. Lynnette watched her and felt a fierce and complicated pride. The Duke managed the table the way he managed everything, with quiet authority that looked effortless and almost certainly was not. He directed conversation, smoothed pauses, gave each person at least one moment of feeling genuinely heard. He had not looked directly at Lynnette since the meal began. She was aware of this with a precision that embarrassed her. She sat between Mr. Wainwright and Mr. Arthur Bligh, Lady Portia's young cousin, who had arrived that afternoon with almost no luggage, and the easy cheerfulness of someone who found most topics equally agreeable. He was pleasant company. Mr. Wainwright was in excellent form, recounting a London theatrical disaster involving collapsing stage machinery and a painted cloud descending onto a tenor at the worst possible dramatic moment. Lady Portia laughed until her eyes watered. Even Lord Fenwick had a reluctant smile working at his mouth. Lynnette smiled at the correct moments and answered Mr. Bligh's easy questions about the county, and all the while remained acutely and unhelpfully aware of the man at the head of the table, the memory of the library and the firelight, and his voice saying, "So are you sitting just beneath the surface of everything she did?" Toward the end of the fish course, Lord Fenwick set his fork down and said, in the deliberate tone of a man transitioning to business, "Dorian, I wanted to raise a matter this evening, if the company permits." The table quieted. The Duke looked at him steadily. "Of course." "It concerns Harriet. I have been in correspondence with a Mr. Graham Aldwell of Edinburgh, a man of good standing and serious character, who has expressed a genuine interest in making her acquaintance with a view to a formal connection. I believe it merits serious consideration." Harriet placed her wine glass down with a precision that meant she was holding something very tightly inside herself. "This is the first I am hearing of it," the Duke said. "I wanted your view before raising it formally. You are her guardian." "It would seem equally important," said the Duke, "to raise it with Harriet." Lord Fenwick looked at his sister with the fond impatience of a man who believed he was being generous and helpful. "Harriet, I want only what is best for you." "I know," Harriet said, "perfectly level. Not a single crack in the surface." "I would appreciate the opportunity to decide what that is for myself, rather than receiving a letter about it while you are under the same roof." A small, charged silence moved around the table. Mr. Wainwright looked at his plate. Miss Graves examined her wine glass with sudden, great interest. Mr. Holt kept his eyes on Harriet with quiet, steady attention that was not intrusive, but was unmistakably present. "This is a conversation better suited to a private moment," the Duke said, with a finality that closed the subject without drama or heat. Lord Fenwick accepted it with a short nod. The table breathed again, and Mr. Wainwright began a new story about a horse auction in Newmarket that restored the surface warmth within 3 minutes. But Lynnette had seen the Duke's face the moment before he redirected the conversation. What she had seen there was not neutral. It was something that looked very much like protectiveness, quiet and certain, and entirely without performance. After dinner, the women moved to the drawing room. Harriet sat beside Lynnette on the settee near the window and said nothing for several minutes. Lady Portia played the piano with slightly more success than usual. Miss Graves complimented the room's furnishings with polished warmth. Odette sat in the far corner with a book she was not really reading, observing everything with her usual undisturbed attention. "He means well," Harriet said finally, very quietly. "I know," Lynnette said. "That almost makes it worse." "Yes," Lynnette agreed. "It does." Harriet turned and looked at her, and something in her expression shifted, the storm moving back and something more searching taking its place. "You are different tonight," she said. "Not worse, just different. Like something has changed, and you have not decided yet what to do with it." Lynnette looked at the fire and said nothing. Harriet didn't press. She simply stayed close, their shoulders nearly touching, which was its own kind of answer and its own kind of comfort. The men returned at 9:30. The room rearranged into smaller conversations. Mr. Wainwright claimed Lady Portia for cards and recruited Mr. Bligh with cheerful insistence. Miss Graves positioned herself near the fireplace where the light was most favourable and began a careful conversation with Lord Fenwick that had the energy of two people quietly assessing each other. Odette moved to the bookshelf and began actually reading something she pulled from the third shelf. Mr. Holt crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest Harriet, and said something quiet that made her laugh genuinely for the first time all evening. Lynnette noted this with the practical part of her mind that was always monitoring Harriet's well-being, and filed it as something worth remembering. The Duke came to stand near the window where she was sitting. He did not sit. He simply stood beside her, looking out at the dark garden, hands clasped behind his back in the posture he used when he was thinking. He said nothing to her directly. The room was too full and too watchful for that. But he had chosen to stand here, and not anywhere else, in a room full of other places to stand. And that choice said something all on its own. After a moment, he said, quietly enough, that only she could hear, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said. "And Harriet?" "She will be," Lynnette said. "She is stronger than anyone in this room gives her credit for." A pause. Then, "I intend to speak with Fenwick privately tomorrow. The Edinburgh matter will not go further without Harriet's full and willing participation. I want you to know that." She looked up at him. He was still facing the window, still composed, still giving the room the performance of a man standing quietly thinking about nothing particular. But his jaw was set in the way it set when something had been decided and wouldn't be undecided. "Thank you," she said quietly. He gave the smallest nod, remained at the window for 3 more minutes, and then moved away to speak with Lord Fenwick across the room. Lynnette exhaled slowly and looked down at her hands, and tried to remember how to simply sit in a chair like a person who was not quietly coming undone, from the far corner of the room without looking up from her book. Odette Fairfax smiled. Saturday morning arrived sharp and cold, the kind of light that stripped everything back to its honest form. No softness, no flattering shadows, just clear winter air and the particular silence of a house that had not yet fully woken. Lynnette was dressed and moving before 6 o'clock. She had not slept well. Not badly either. She had lain in the dark with her eyes open, and her thoughts arranged and rearranged themselves like furniture being moved in a room that was not quite the right size for any configuration. The library, the firelight. His voice says, "So are you," with that complete and devastating simplicity. The way he had stood at the window during the drawing room and chosen her corner of it without making a single obvious thing of the choice. She had written 3 words in the journal before she slept. I stood still. She did not fully understand yet what she was going to do with any of it. But she understood that something had shifted permanently, and that the version of herself who had hidden feelings beneath floorboards and called it sensible was not coming back. She was crossing the lower corridor at 6:30 when she heard voices in the morning room. The door was not fully closed. She took 1 step past it and stopped. Lord Fenwick and the Duke. She is 20 years old, Dorian. Lord Fenwick's voice carried the particular patience of a man who believed he was being reasonable. She needs direction. Aldwell is a stable, serious, excellent family. This is an opportunity. It is an arrangement she was not consulted about, the Duke said. Quiet, entirely final. She is young. She does not always know what serves her best. She is 20 years old, and she is one of the sharpest people in this house. Something had entered the Duke's voice that Lynnette had never heard there before. Not anger. Something older and more decided than anger. I will not present her with a future she did not choose, and dress it up as a gift. That is not guardianship. That is management, and I will not do it. Silence. Then Lord Fenwick, quieter now. You could at least allow her to meet him. Let her form her own view. If Harriet wishes to meet him after being given the full choice and no pressure in any direction, I will facilitate it gladly. If she does not wish for it, the matter ends there permanently. A pause. She is not a piece in an arrangement, Theo. She is a person. Treat her as one. Lynnette moved away from the door before the conversation could end, and either of them found her standing in the corridor. She went directly to Harriet and told her everything she had heard, quietly and without softening any of it. Harriet listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when Lynnette finished there was a long silence. Then Harriet picked up her teacup, set it down again, and blinked twice in rapid succession in the way she did when she was absolutely not going to cry, and was very serious about it. "He said that," Harriet said. "Not as all question," confirming something to herself. "Those exact words," Lynnette said. Harriet stood and went to the window and looked out at the cold morning garden for a long moment. When she turned back, her expression had changed entirely. The storm was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more settled, the look of a person who has just discovered that the ground beneath them is more solid than they had assumed. "I owe him an apology," she said. "I was so angry yesterday, I assumed he knew and had done nothing. I did not consider that Theo had acted without telling him." She paused. "And I owe you a great deal for telling me." "You owe me nothing," Lynnette said. "I owe you everything," Harriet said, with a firmness that closed the argument. She crossed the room and took Lynnette's hands briefly and looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "And I want you to know something. Whatever is happening between you and my guardian, and do not tell me nothing is happening, because I have eyes and I have known you for 3 years, I am in favor of it. Completely. Without reservation. You are not a lesser person because you came here as my companion. You have never been lesser. Not for a single day." The warmth that moved through Lynnette at those words was almost too large to hold quietly. She pressed Harriet's hands and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, and Harriet understood this perfectly and released her and became brisk in the way she did after emotional moments, moving toward her wardrobe and announcing that she intended to speak to her brother before the morning walk, and that she would need her green wool walking dress and her composure in equal measure. The morning walk to the Folly assembled at 10:30 with the disorganized energy of 8 people attempting to leave a house simultaneously. Mr. Wainwright was already narrating before he reached the front steps. Mr. Bligh forgot his gloves twice. Miss Graves appeared in a perfectly arranged cream-walking ensemble that made Lady Portia narrow her eyes with the involuntary competitiveness of someone who had underestimated the morning. Odette fell into step beside Lynnette at the back of the group before they had crossed the first field. "Harriet looks better," Odette said. "She does," Lynnette agreed. "And you look like someone who has made a decision and has not yet told anyone about it. You are remarkably perceptive for this hour of the morning." "I am remarkably perceptive at all hours," Odette said pleasantly. "It is my most useful and most exhausting quality." She glanced sideways. "He asked Mr. Crane which path you usually take on your morning walks. Before breakfast. I happened to be in the corridor at the time." Lynnette said nothing. "Still just making observations," Odette said, and smiled into the middle distance. The Folly was a 20-minute walk across the north grounds, a small stone tower that one of the earlier dukes had constructed for reasons history had not clearly recorded. Mr. Wainwright had 4 theories of increasing implausibility about its original purpose, all of which he delivered with great conviction over the course of the walk, while Mr. Bligh listened with genuine uncertainty about which to believe. At the Folly, the group spread naturally. Lady Portia climbed the lower steps to look at the view. Mr. Wainwright followed her with the energy of a man who treated every small elevation as a personal challenge. Miss Graves stood at the base and directed architectural observations at Lord Fenwick, who was listening with the polite attention of a man still slightly chastened from the morning's conversation. Harriet and Mr. Holt arrived still deep in conversation, having fallen into it somewhere on the path, and apparently found no reason to stop. They moved to the east wall of the folly and continued talking with the absorbed quality of two people who had discovered an unexpected and mutual frequency. Lynnette stood apart from the group and looked out at the bare winter fields stretching beyond the estate grounds, and let herself simply be still for a moment. "The third theory," said the Duke, arriving beside her with the quiet step she had always been attuned to, "is that the folly was built as a retreat. Somewhere outside the main house, where a person could think without being responsible for everything inside it." She looked at the small stone tower. "That is Mr. Wainwright's third theory." "No, that one is mine." He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the fields. "My father used to walk out here. I came with him once at about 12 years old. He did not say anything the entire walk. We stood here for a while and went back. At the time, I thought he was being strange. I understand it considerably better now." She thought about a 12-year-old version of this man, walking silently across these same cold fields, learning without knowing he was learning something about the weight of responsibility and the necessity of occasionally stepping outside it. "I heard you this morning," she said, "with Lord Fenwick. I want to be transparent about that. And I want you to know that I told Harriet what was said." He was quiet for a moment. "Good. She should have known immediately. I should have gone to her last night." "You could not have known what Theo had already sent to her room." "No," he said. "But I could have asked." He exhaled slowly, a small visible breath in the cold air. Then he turned and looked at her directly, which he had not done yet today, and what was in his face when he did it was completely unguarded in a way that the Duke of Ashvere's face almost never was. "Are we all right?" he asked. "After last night?" The question was so simple and so honest, it caught her completely off guard. "Yes," she said. "We are." Something in him settled visibly at that, a small but real release of something held, and she filed it in the same place she kept everything about. Him, except that the place was no longer hidden under a floorboard. It was simply hers, sitting in plain sight inside her chest. Miss Graves was watching from the folly steps with an expression that was thoughtful and not particularly warm. Lynnette saw it and did not move away. She stood where she was and let herself be seen standing there. On the walk back, something shifted in the texture of the group. Mr. Wainwright had temporarily exhausted himself and settled into companionable quiet with Lady Portia. Lord Fenwick walked beside Harriet, and whatever Harriet was saying to him was measured and clear, and made him listen in a way he hadn't listened yesterday. Odette walked with Mr. Bligh, who was nodding with the earnest attentiveness of someone receiving information he had not known he needed. Mr. Holt fell back until he was walking near Lynnette, slightly apart from the rest, and said quietly, "She is remarkable." Lynnette did not need to ask who he meant. "She is," she agreed. He said nothing more, but the way he said those two words, with that careful, contained quality, told her everything about the state of Mr. Sebastian Holt that she needed to know. That evening after dinner, when the drawing-room had settled into its smaller conversations and the fire had burned down to a deep, steady glow, something happened that nobody had anticipated. Miss Graves set down her wine glass, looked across the room at the Duke with her sharp green eyes, and said, clearly enough for the nearest people to hear, "Your Grace, I wonder if I might speak plainly." The room did not go entirely silent, but it thinned, the way rooms do when something real is about to be said inside them. The Duke looked at her with his steady, unreadable expression. "Of course. I came here this weekend with a particular expectation," Miss Graves said. She was composed, Lynnette noticed, not wounded, not performing distress, simply honest in the direct way of a woman who had decided that honesty was more useful than strategy. "I believe Lady Portia may have given me reason for that expectation. However, I am not a foolish person, and I am not a person who requires a situation to be explained to her at length." She paused. "I simply want it acknowledged." A silence. "You have my complete respect," the Duke said, "and my sincere apology if any expectation was created that I did not intend and could not honor." Miss Graves nodded once. She picked up her wine glass again. "Thank you," she said. "That is all I wanted." And she turned back to her conversation with Mr. Bligh as though nothing of particular significance had occurred, which was, Lynnette thought, one of the most dignified things she had ever witnessed. Lady Portia caught her brother's eye from across the room with an expression that was equal parts chagrin and reluctant understanding. He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that was entirely a sibling conversation, conducted without a single word. Later, when the guests began drifting toward bed and the room was thinning out, Harriet paused beside Lynnette on her way to the door and said, very quietly, "Miss Graves just did something genuinely graceful. I want you to notice that." "I noticed," Lynnette said. "Good." Harriet squeezed her hand. "Now go to sleep. Tomorrow is going to ask something of you, and you will want to be rested for it." Lynnette looked at her. "What do you mean?" Harriet smiled in the small, private way she used when she knew something she was not going to say yet. "Good night, Lynnette," she said, and left. Lynnette sat alone in the thinning drawing room for a while after everyone had gone, the fire low and the candles burning their last inch, and she opened her journal on her knee and looked at the 3 words she had written the night before. I stood still. Then she picked up her pen and wrote underneath them, and I did not look away. And she closed the book and held it in both hands, and let the quiet settle around her like something that had finally been allowed to exist. Sunday arrived the way resolutions arrive, quietly, without announcement, with a quality of finality that made everything feel both heavier and lighter at the same time. The guests were leaving after luncheon. The house knew it, the way houses always know when a particular season is ending, the particular quality of movement in the corridors, luggage appearing at doorways, conversations taking on the slightly heightened warmth of people preparing to say goodbye. Mr. Wainwright departed exactly as he had arrived, already mid-story before his luggage was fully loaded, this time about something that had happened at breakfast involving a misidentified jam and Mr. Bligh's general willingness to believe anything he was told. Lady Portia embraced him warmly at the door. The Duke shook his hand with the expression of a man who was genuinely fond of someone he also found genuinely exhausting. Mr. Bligh left next, pleasant and uncomplicated to the last, shaking hands with everyone in the entrance. Hall with equal warmth and telling Lynnette sincerely that he hoped the county treated her well, which was such a simple and kind thing to say that she found she meant it completely when she thanked him. Miss Graves said her goodbyes with the same composure she had shown the previous evening, elegant and unhurried. She embraced Lady Portia. She shook the Duke's hand without any weight attached to the gesture, which spoke well of her in a way that required no commentary. When she reached Lynnette, she paused and looked at her for a moment with those sharp green eyes, and what was in them was not resentment. It was something closer to recognition. One honest woman to another. "Take care of yourself, Miss Vale," she said. "And you, Miss Graves," Lynnette said. She meant it, and she believed that Miss Graves knew she did. Odette was the last of the women to leave. She came to find Lynnette specifically, walking past 3 other people in the entrance hall to reach her, and took both her hands and held them for a moment and said, "Write to me. Not occasionally, regularly. I want to know everything." "Everything is a great deal," Lynnette said. "I am aware," Odette said. "I want it anyway." She glanced once, quickly and deliberately, at the Duke standing near the door, and then back at Lynnette, and her expression said everything her words did not. And then she was gone, out the door and into the carriage, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had said what she came to say. Mr. Holt was the last guest to say goodbye. He shook the Duke's hand and thanked him with genuine warmth. He said farewell to Lady Portia and to Lynnette and to Mr. Crane, and then he turned to Harriet. There was a pause between them, one beat too long to be purely social. 2 people standing in a doorway with something unfinished between them that both of them were aware of, and neither of them was yet in a position to address directly. "I will be in London in the spring," he said. "So will I," Harriet said. Her voice was perfectly steady, and her eyes were very bright. "Then I hope we will meet again," he said. "I expect we will," she said. And she smiled at him with her full, honest smile, the one she reserved for things she actually meant, and he carried it with him all the way to the carriage, and Lynnette watched him go with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just seen the first line of a very good story written. Lord Fenwick was the final departure. He had spent Sunday morning in a long conversation with Harriet in the garden, 3 full circuits of the east lawn, their pace slowing and their heads drawing closer as the circuits progressed. When they came inside, neither of them spoke about what had been said, but Harriet's face had lost its held quality entirely, and Lord Fenwick was carrying himself with a slightly less certain authority than usual, which Lynnette thought was genuinely good for him. At the door, he shook the Duke's hand and looked at his sister, and said simply, "I hear you, Harriet. I should have listened sooner." Harriet kissed his cheek. "Yes," she said, "you should have. But you are listening now, which counts for something." He smiled at that, the genuine, unguarded version, which made him look considerably more like his sister than he usually did, and then he was in the carriage and gone. When the last carriage disappeared down the drive, the house exhaled. The kind of deep, real exhale that only comes when a particular sustained effort has finally concluded. Mrs. Dallow moved through the rooms, directing the restoration of order, with her usual quiet authority. Mr. Crane supervised the clearing of the dining room with the satisfaction of a man whose household had performed flawlessly under pressure, and knew it. The footman moved quickly and efficiently, and the house began, room by room, to return to itself. Harriet found Lynnette in the upstairs sitting room at 4 o'clock and dropped into the armchair across from her, and said, "I like Mr. Holt." "I know," Lynnette said. "He listens properly. Not the way people listen when they are waiting for their turn." "Actually?" She pulled her feet up onto the chair in a way Mrs. Dallow would have corrected. "I also think Odette Fairfax is one of the finest people I have ever known, and I intend to write to her twice a week until she tells me to stop, which I suspect she never will." "I suspect not," Lynnette agreed. Harriet looked at her then, with the full searching look she reserved for things that mattered. "He is going to speak to you today," she said. "Properly. Finally. The way he should have spoken months ago, possibly years ago, but did not because he is extremely capable at everything except saying the true thing to the person he most needs to say it to." She paused. "When he does, I want you to let yourself receive it. Do not make yourself smaller than you are to make it easier for anyone else. Not even him. Lynnette looked at her. Harriet. I mean, every word of it, Harriet said, with a firmness that was also love. You have spent 3 years making yourself small in this house, and I have watched it and said nothing because it was not my place and because you seemed content. But I know now that content and happiness are not the same thing, and I want you to be happy. She stood and smoothed her skirt and became immediately brisk. I am going to have a headache tomorrow. I can feel it forming. I am going to bed early tonight. Do not let anyone disturb me for anything short of a structural emergency. She left with a decisive click of the door. Lynnette sat in the quiet room for a long time after she had gone. The late afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, warming the floor in a long, narrow stripe that moved slowly across the carpet as the sun shifted. She thought about 3 years of this house. The floorboard, the journal. Every morning she had tied the red ribbon, and every evening she had untied it, and all the space in between where she had been honest only with herself. She thought about standing still in a cold field and what it had meant. She thought about Harriet's words, "Do not make yourself smaller than you are," and felt them settle somewhere deep and permanent. She was still sitting with all of it when Mr. Crane appeared in the doorway with his 15 years of professional composure arranged perfectly on his face, and said, "His Grace asks if you might join him in the library at your convenience, Miss Vale." She looked at Mr. Crane for a moment. He looked back at her with the practiced neutrality of a man who saw everything and commented on nothing, and in whose expression she could nonetheless detect, if she looked carefully, the faintest quality of something that was not quite approval, but was not far from it. "Thank you, Mr. Crane," she said. "I will go now." The library was warm. The fire had been built up properly. The curtains drawn against the early dark, the room holding its heat and golden light in a way that made it feel complete and self-contained, a world with its own weather. The Duke was standing at the far end of the room when she entered, not at the bookshelf this time, not at the window, simply standing in the middle of the room, facing the door, as though he had been waiting and had not wanted to pretend otherwise. She came fully into the room. She did not grip the doorframe. She let the door close behind her, and she looked at him across the warm golden space, and she waited. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to say this without getting in my own way." "You could simply say it," she offered. Something warm and real crossed his face. "Yes." He came toward her slowly, stopping when there was a comfortable but not distant space between them, close enough that she could see every small thing his expression was doing. "I have responsibilities that do not diminish, obligations that are permanent, a family that requires consistent attention, and a household that depends on my judgment. I say this not as a warning, but as a truth I want you to hold fully before you consider anything at all." "I have lived inside all of those things for 3 years, she said. "I understand their weight." "I know," he said. "And you stayed. Through all of it. Every difficult season and every complicated month. You stayed, and you were honest, and you were kind, and you made this house a better place than it was before you came." His voice was very steady and very quiet. "And I am in love with you. I want to be completely clear about that. Not uncertain, not cautiously hopeful. I am in love with you, and I have been for longer than was comfortable, and I am done conducting myself in a way that prevents me from saying so." The fire, the light, the room held its breath around them. She thought about every word she had ever written in the journal, every entry she had hidden and tied, shut and pressed beneath a floorboard and told herself was safe. She thought about the moment she had thought it was all over, standing in the empty cottage with her back against the door and the knock that had come. And him in the doorway with the journal pressed against his side, and those words, steady and irreversible. I have read every word. She thought about everything she had been too careful to say for 3 years, and she decided, firmly and finally, that she was done being careful with it. I wrote something in my journal the night before last, she said. 3 words. I stood still. She held his gaze without flinching. I wrote it because that was the moment I knew what I was choosing. When you asked me not to move away in that field, and I chose to stay, I knew exactly what I was doing. He crossed the remaining space between them and took her hand in both of his, warm and certain, and looked at her from the distance of 2 people who had finally stopped pretending. "What were you choosing?" he asked, quietly, like he already knew and wanted to hear her say it. "You," she said. "I was choosing you. I think I have been choosing you for a very long time and simply did not have anywhere honest enough to say it until now." He lifted her hand and held it against his chest, directly over his heart, and the gesture was so deliberate and so simple and so completely without performance that every remaining defense she had dissolved entirely, and she did not try to rebuild any of it. They stood there in the warm library with the fire burning steadily behind them, and the winter night pressed dark against the windows, and 3 years of careful distance, finally, completely gone. They talked for 2 hours, not about practical arrangements, or what Lady Portia would say, or what Mrs. Dallow would think, though all of those things existed and would need their proper time. They talked the way they had talked that night in March that she had written 4 pages about, except that this time neither of them would go upstairs afterward and fold it quietly away. This time it was allowed to exist in full daylight, or in firelight, which was close enough. When she finally stood to leave, he walked with her to the library door and stopped there and looked at her in the warm gold of the dying fire. "The entry from the 2nd of January, he said. She blinked. "You memorized the dates." "I told you I read every word," he said. "I meant it precisely." He paused. "You wrote that you had decided to stop feeling what you felt because it was not useful and not appropriate and would not lead anywhere worth going. And then you wrote that you had made that decision the previous evening and were already failing at it by morning." She laughed, the full unguarded version, the one she kept only for moments when there was no performance required of her and nothing to manage and nowhere to be except exactly where she was. He watched her laugh with an expression that was completely open, the most open she had ever seen his face be, like something that had been held shut for a very long time had simply and finally decided to stop. "I was spectacularly bad at stopping," she said. "I know," he said. "I am deeply, permanently glad." She walked back through the quiet evening house, past Mrs. Dallow, giving instructions to the night staff with her usual composed efficiency, past Mr. Crane, making his final round with his usual air of a man who had seen everything and would take it all to his grave, past Harriet's closed door, where a lamp still burned softly, and the faint sound of a turning page said the headache had not yet arrived, and the night was still peaceful. In her own room she sat at the small desk and opened the journal and untied the red ribbon for the last time in the way she used to untie it, alone and quiet and careful. She looked at what she had written. I stood still, and I did not look away. She picked up her pen and wrote underneath both lines, slowly and clearly, and he came to me, and I let him. She closed the journal. She tied the ribbon. And then she did something she had never done in 3 years of keeping it. She set it on the desk in plain sight, not beneath the floorboard, not tucked into a drawer, not managed into a smaller space than it deserved. She left it there, small and leather-bound with its worn red ribbon, sitting in the open like something that no longer needed to hide, because it did not. Because she did not. In the library at the other end of the house, a lamp burned late into the night. The Duke of Ashfire sat in the chair beside the fire with the particular stillness of a man who has said the true thing at last, and found it not only received, but returned in full. He was not reading. He was not working. He was simply sitting in the warm, quiet room with the deep and genuine peace of someone who had stopped waiting for something and found it waiting for him instead. Outside, the winter night settled over Ashfire House completely, dark and still and full of the particular rest that belongs only to things that have finally, after a very long time, been allowed to be exactly what they are. And inside the house, in 2 separate rooms, connected by 3 years of careful silence, and 1 small journal with a red ribbon, 2 people sat with the truth between them at last, no longer hidden, no longer managed, no longer anything less than completely real. If this story reached something in you, you already know what to do. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you will ever know. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is exactly the right time, because the next story is already waiting, and it deserves to find you here.